The figure we're most familiar with in heralding the coming of the Messiah, of course, is John the Baptist. But today we commemorate St. John of the Cross. He was a saint who was very familiar with St. Therese of Avila, but he also heralded the coming of the Lord through his mysteries, his faith, his mystic experiences, and his poetry. This is Father Lou. Let's go to the homily. We're in the season of Advent, a season of preparation, and the preparation for the original Advent, of course, that we celebrate, is the birth of Christ. And the key figure in pointing out who that was to come was John the Baptizer. And he features a lot in the Gospels of Advent, and especially on Sunday. He'll be identified. But through the history of our church, there have been other people who prepare us, almost like this, pointing. And I do that on purpose, as you know. The graphics in Byzantine churches on the iconostasis, which is the large screen before the sanctuary, usually features Mary holding Jesus on one side of the door, and the other side, St. John the Baptist going like this, pointing to Jesus. So when we talked about John the Baptist, this is a good symbol of him because he points to Jesus. Now today we commemorate the feast of St. John of the Cross. You might know him as being a friend of St. Therese of Avila, and you might remember some of his mystical works. He was a poet, he was an artist. He also did a sketch one day. He was in the choir loft looking down, and he made a sketch of a sculpture of Christ on the cross from above. Well, that was made famous by Salvatore Dali, and he made this beautiful, again, in imitation of John of the Cross, painting of a very, very strange view of the Christ hanging on the cross. And I think it's very significant that his influence, especially in Spain, and Salvatore Dali was Spanish, still goes on. He was a mystic. He was a very dedicated person. And in a sense, today's gospel sort of appreciates him when we read great crowds were following Jesus, and Jesus turns around and says to them, "You can't come after me without denying everything. Your family, your possessions, and then follow me and take up your cross." Well, John, who eventually changed his name to John of the Cross, it wasn't that originally, was a Carmelite monk, and through his ministry, he took this very seriously. He suffered a lot. He came in contact with the mystical experiences of faith and Christ, and he went through his own kind of preparation, denial, hunger, wearing itchy clothing. I mean, things like that we don't necessarily do today as a sign of mortification. But he did. Eventually, he meets St. Therese of Avila, and he becomes a descalced monk, you might say. He gets very serious about even more serious about his vocation, and together they open up convents, Carmelite convents. So we have in John someone who suffered for his faith because, it was funny, I was with someone last night, and I was talking about Pope Francis, and the woman said to me, "Oh, you know, he comes from a communist country, and he thinks in a communist way and a socialist way." Well, you know, you're talking about Francis, he's my buddy, I'm sorry. And, well, guess what? Our faith as Christians is socialist, is communist. Not atheistic communism, not political socialism, but it is communism. It is respect for the community, respect for the whole, respect for the body. And socialism in a sense of taking care of those who are hungry and weak and lack, whatever they lack, whatever resources. And of course, Francis has been focusing on that through his whole ministry. But people like John of the Cross also focused on that. Anybody who points to Jesus has to at least, not get into the political aspect of it, but at least look at what Jesus himself did. You want to follow me? I want all of you. But you can't pick and choose. You've got to give me your whole self. Now, this is the John the Baptist this is the person John the Baptist is pointing to. I mean, John wasn't popular in his own day. Eventually, he was beheaded. John of the Cross wasn't popular in his own day. As a matter of fact, other religious communities imprisoned him for a while because he was too radical. And the word radical is important. It comes from the Latin radix, which means root. So he was very rooted in a very staunch attitude of keeping Christ's word. And in that staunch relationship he developed with Christ, he had mystical experiences. I mean, experiences of communing with Christ that he writes about in his many, many books. And of course, during that period, it was the post-Reformation period. Mysticism was rising high in the church as a way of counteracting the Reformation. So he was right there, politically, socially, and spiritually. And he stood out as a result of that. John the Baptist stood out as a result of that. John the Baptist was confined, eventually beheaded for what he did. John of the Cross wasn't beheaded, but he was confined and eventually released for what he did. But this goes on. They point to Christ. And what did Christ do? He was crucified for what he believed. And when he says to take up your cross, that phrase has various meanings. And I don't think Jesus meant the crucifixion kind of cross. I think Jesus was referring to the terminology of the day, the Tau, okay? And to take up your Tau really meant you got to follow me from A to Z. Tau is the last letter of the alphabet, the Aramaic alphabet. So Jesus is saying, you want to follow me? You got to follow me completely. A to Z. Leave everything else aside. Now, it doesn't say hate your mother. He does say hate your mother and father, but let's clarify that. It's not hating those who are close to us. It's not hating anybody. It's choosing and putting aside, and even in second place, anything that would prevent us from having, we'll say like John, the saint, a mystical experience with Christ. You don't have to float. You don't have to rise up. You don't have to see visions in the sky. But we are called to follow Christ and have a mystical, spiritual experience with him. And then bring it into the world. Yes. Socially, communally, and in the Christian family.